You know how it is when the music gets you. You start to move. They say that when the spirit enters the room, we're moved. To move is to progress, to allow for the possibility of transformation, from stillness to action, from oppression to freedom, from the past into the future. Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. After the election of George W. Bush in 2000, Aaron Goldberg began wondering what he could do in the next election to help make a difference. At the time, he was a 26-year-old piano player, only a few years out of college, but who was quickly establishing himself as a credible musical voice in the jazz world, and as a musician who is dedicated to helping move people in multiple senses of the word. Aaron was raised outside of Boston. He began playing piano at a young age, got interested in jazz almost immediately, and moved to New York at age 17 to study at the New School. But he also came from a rather traditional family with rather traditional ideas about higher education, and he was equally at home in academia as he was on the bandstand anyway. So all of this led him to leave New York and ultimately get a degree from Harvard in history and science. But after he graduated, he moved back to New York to pursue his music career in earnest, and he began working regularly with Mark Turner and with Joshua Redman. He's made a large handful of fantastic albums as a leader and co-leads a project called Yes Trio with drummer Ali Jackson and bassist Omer Avital. Their most recent album, Spring Sings, came out earlier this year, and what you hear behind me is the title track. Aaron has worked as an in-demand sideman with a long list of legendary artists, and he was once described in the New York Times as a post-bop pianist of exemplary taste and range. I spoke to him at the Montreal Jazz Festival for this podcast in 2022, and we talked extensively about his musical career. You can hear that interview in the archive. But in the midst of all that musical momentum, he managed to get a master's degree in analytic philosophy from Tufts University, commuting from New York to Boston for classes and juggling performances with the likes of Wynton Marsalis and Kurt Rosenwinkel and his own bands too. So from the very beginning, Aaron's theoretical brain and his musical heart have been commingling. And that is made immediately clear in any conversation with him. He tells me that he chose to play this music because it was just something that moved him with a beauty that he didn't understand when he first encountered it. But while the music at first reached him on an emotional level, he was also deeply aware of the political and protest roots of jazz. So, as the 2004 election approached, and it was clear that George W. Bush stood a very real chance of being elected for a second term, Aaron was outraged by what he calls the incompetence and the immorality of the entire administration. And he was surprised by conversations he had with his peers in the jazz community who seemed to have disengaged from the political process. So he started to think about what he could do that would be bigger, that would help to bring people together and try to reorient them. To be, as he says, proud, not of being detached, but of engaging in all the messy details. This profound concern about both the election and the political conversations in his own music community inspired him to organize Jazz for America's Future in 2004. It was a fundraising concert for John Kerry, and it featured performances by Michael Brecker, Savion Glover, Christian McBride, Jeff Tain Watts, Joshua Redman, and Dee Dee Bridgewater, among others. Aaron Goldberg has organized a similar event in every presidential cycle since 2004. This year's event, called Jazz for Kamala, was held at Le Poisson Rouge in New York on Sunday, October 20th, which was conveniently, and as he tells us, coincidentally, booked on the 60th birthday of Kamala Harris. Performers included Kenny Barron, Al Foster, Jeff Tain Watts, Ron Carter, Joe Lovano, Joshua Redman, Dee Dee Bridgewater, Christian McBride, and Aaron Goldberg himself, among others. Check him out playing with Christian McBride and Al Foster. I grabbed a little short recording on my phone from the audience. Jazz for Kamala raised $42,000 on the day of the show, and donations can still be made on the website. It's jazzforkamala.com. Aaron and I spoke the following day, as of this recording that was yesterday, to talk about the potential of music to provoke personal transformation and political action. His own relationship with activism and progressive politics, public education, concert curation, and Gaza. Please consider subscribing to my Substack. It's leosidran.substack.com to get new podcast episodes, articles, and news from me. Also, you can check out the full archive of episodes at third-story.com, including past episodes with, fellow Massachusettsans like Adam Schatz, Larry Goldings, John Fields, George Wein, Ella Feingold, and Lauren Henderson. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you do your podcasting. Tell your friends, leave stars, leave a review. I make this thing almost entirely alone. You can help me to grow it by spreading the word. And most importantly, remember to vote. Here's me and Aaron Goldberg having this very moving talk in Brooklyn yesterday. I want to get the sort of the background on this and how you started putting this together, but I also think it is such an opportunity to talk about why jazz is the perfect platform to talk about democracy. So having said that, Aaron Goldberg, I can't even believe I got you to come here today, considering I saw what you had to deal with last night, which could not have been an easy puzzle to put together.
I'll admit that I'm a little tired. I might be exhausted even, but it's always a pleasure to come talk to you and especially get to see your little studio here.
Yeah.
You know, there's an enormous amount of reward, obviously, that comes from putting in that kind of work. And I honestly could only do it once every 4 years. It has always felt like a civic duty. You know, I have huge admiration for people that work on any kind of public service or political issues, social activists included, that give their life to trying to make this planet a better place, this city a better place, this country a better place. And I feel like we musicians, we may sometimes take for granted that our music makes this country, world, planet, you know, city a better place without really having a theory of how that is supposed to work. And if we're reasonably successful, then we often encounter fans of our music or fans of bands that we play in who thank us, you know, thank us for the experience that they've received, either in a club or from listening to us on albums. We get that kind of positive feedback that, in fact, there is some kind of positivity that emerges from our music. You know, we make music to move people, and I'm not sure that moving people translates directly into socio-political benefit. It definitely makes human beings happy and to experience emotions and beauty, and that seems to be our primary job, you know, how to transform notes into emotions in an audience and in ourselves. And when the concert is great, you know, and an audience gets to experience 4 or 5, 2, or even one person in harmony with each other and ourselves on stage, they have this feeling of wanting to become a part of it. There's this philosopher I like named Bracha Ettinger, who's also a psychoanalyst. She talks about the fragilization of the self. So the self breaks down, so to speak, psychologically, and you feel as an audience member that you're on stage or one with the musicians. The audience gets pulled in. We like to use these metaphors of pulling them in, or the opposite. We lost them. We feel disconnected, or they feel disconnected from us, or the audience complains the band just felt like they were up there, you know, masturbating or playing for each other, but not for us. When the concert is great, the opposite feeling of synergy happens, and Bracha talks about it in terms of like returning to the initial state of existence, which is being one with the mother, one in the womb. And yourself has not differentiated itself from the larger outside world or entity, right? So you are one with another, you are part of something larger than yourself. And we use these words in a spiritual or religious context all the time. You can feel it in a nature type setting. You can feel it, you know, when you're listening to a symphony or choral music sometimes, or if you get to sing in a chorus with a large number of people and harmonize with your fellow humans. Music can put you in that state of being part of something larger, and it usually makes you feel good. Now, I think it's a much more complex, fascinating, important question whether that then translates into any kind of societal change, whether it helps you act in harmony with your fellow citizens, for example, to try to change your society, or in this case, you know, figure out the right person to vote for and vote for them, or translate into, you know, fighting for Proposition 1, or, you know, raising money for your friend who's running for Congress on Long Island. Like, how does moving our fellow humans actually translate into creating a better world is a question that most of my fellow musicians don't really wrestle with, because it's such a hard question to answer. Yeah. And there's really no proof, and it's not clear how you would design the experiment to test it, right? To test any theory that you might have of how your great music is going to translate. So this is all assuming that you can actually even move people, which is why we put all these hours into our craft to get to that point where we can move people. So just to take us back to the concert last night, it's actually based on a very, very simple answer to this question, which is one easily demonstrable way that we can use our music to move people into doing something to try to make our world better is to invite them to a fundraising concert for a politician who we think, is the better of the available options in a given election. Now, it's just most easy to motivate people to care about presidential elections. And as I mentioned on stage last night, at the very beginning of the night, this process started in 2004 because I had many conversations in 2000 with my fellow musicians and some music fans. I was much younger then. I was in my 20s. I was part of what I thought of as an idealistic group of musicians with shared values. And I was shocked to discover how many of them either were not going to vote at all because they'd become disillusioned with our, two-party system, which does require an insane and inordinate and unhealthy and immoral amount of money to function, right? And is in fact a capitalist system,
yes.
right? It's
an enormous amount of compromise also.
An enormous amount of compromise. Or they were going to vote for Ralph Nader as a protest against this flawed system that we live in, and also because Nader himself had done a lot of good within this flawed system. So I could understand his appeal, of course, and I myself was attracted to voting for him, but I was also firmly convinced that a vote for Nader was essentially a vote for George W. Bush.
Which it was.
I'm glad you agree. People still debate this all
yes.
the time. But we could see the practical result that, in fact, Al Gore lost the election by 500 votes. Regardless of how you feel about the Supreme Court process that followed, the vote was essentially a tie. From my perspective, and it led to an insane amount of death and destruction around the world, the worst foreign policy mistake that I ever saw in my lifetime, the Iraq War, which we're still dealing with the consequences of, and an enormous missed opportunity to deal with climate change, which was an issue that Al Gore worked very hard to wake us up to long before we actually woke up to it. And various people would tell me, musicians whom I respected and I was playing with at the time, the two parties are the same, two candidates are the same, they're all corrupted by money, and
that
the
was
system
Nader's
is messed
point
up.
of view.
But they didn't get it from Nader.
Yeah.
That was how Nader received his 5%, by speaking that truth.
Yeah.
But it's another logical step to accept that truth and then go vote for Nader. Because, again, if you vote for Nader instead of Gore, you better be ready for George Bush to take over, and that means for Dick Cheney to take over and Donald Rumsfeld to take over. And if you don't do a fair amount of research and study, and you don't follow politics closely, you don't realize what the difference between a George Bush foreign policy team or even domestic policy team and an Al Gore foreign policy team or domestic policy team translates into in practice. You're not thinking about how X will translate into Y and Y will translate into Z, and my life will change and people will die. And we ended up with all these foreign policy neoconservatives who designed the Iraq War and, perpetrated a big lie on the American people and killed a lot of innocent people and also caused ourselves an insane amount of not just reputation demise, but also blood and treasure, as they say. Like we've never recovered from that drastic decision. And it's crazy to think that 500 votes in Florida made the difference.
So that's when you thought
that's when I said
you could make a difference.
So I didn't actually realize at that point that maybe a jazz concert could help.
Yeah.
On the contrary, I was just angry. I was just, first of all, shocked and horrified. I remember the election perfectly. I remember that I was in Madrid in a hotel. I went to bed after watching the results at about 2 or 3 in the morning. Spain time, looked like Gore had won. I woke up in the morning, 9 a.m. Spain time, looked like maybe Gore hadn't won, and then the mess started. And I was just shocked that we were in that situation. So it's one of those moments. It's not quite the same as JFK being assassinated, but it's one of those moments we will always remember.
Yeah.
That because I remembered all of these conversations that I'd had with people who were fed up with the system, what we would consider the far left now, and were either voting for Nader or just more commonly refused to vote. And they were just cynical and uninformed. And I was shocked that most of them were very intelligent people who did pay attention to all sorts of other issues that I cared about, did have the same moral values as me. They had just kind of bid the system goodbye, and I think they took a certain pride in that because we're musicians. We're above the system. We care about higher things. We see the big picture, and we see that it's all bullshit.
Yeah.
We don't want to dig into the weeds and get into the messy details because they're all so cynical and it's just part of the system that we don't believe in. And it's a waste of our time, essentially.
Beneath us.
It's beneath us. I was shocked when I started thinking more about that because, the music was always so sociopolitically engaged from the beginning. It was, it was a product of African-American culture, which was itself marginalized severely during a time of, racism we can't even really imagine, contemplate today. It's completely ingrained in society. And it was a protest music in 50 different ways that, I could spend months talking about. An assertion of common humanity, a aspiration to express the genius of people that are treated as second-class citizens, as well as, of course, move and change the society and protest various things that are wrong with it. It's impossible to separate music from the civil rights movement, jazz music in particular, just like it's impossible to separate, South African music from the anti-apartheid movement there. So how did we get so disconnected that musicians could, profoundly great, brilliant musicians, could be proud of the fact that they're above the system, meaning, above in quotes, like we are not engaged and proud to not engage with this. So that troubled me, and I started to feel like we not only need to do something, but we need to try to address this issue in our community. I don't want to blame any one person for it. I don't think it happened in any intentional way, and I think many people who were ascendant in that period, including Wynton himself and Lincoln Center, were actually activists in many ways.
Well, there was always the narrative of jazz and democracy, jazz as a democratic exercise. What happens technically on stage between musicians as being an assertion of democratic values. And that was part of, or has been part of, Wynton's narrative for a long time.
Correctly, part of it, and it's the Ralph Ellison, Stanley Crouch, Albert Murray narrative that I think is completely on point. But I think Wynton himself, I know him a bit, and I've discussed this with him, was also motivated 1,000% correctly to try to counter this idea that jazz is merely America's greatest art form as opposed to African America's greatest art form. It's a Black American art form. The great progenitors of it, the icons of it, the exponents of it are all Black American geniuses. And there was some debates among critics that you probably remember in the back of your mind during that time, like how important was Big Spiderbeck, et cetera. Wynton won all those debates. Wynton and Stanley Crouch won them because they were right. Like, you just can't compare the influence of the great white musicians to the great Black musicians. And why would you even want to try? None of the great white musicians would ever claim to be as influential on the on this music as the Charlie Parkers and the Louis Armstrongs and the Duke Ellingtons and the Thelonious Monks. So Wynton did have an activist mentality about that, and he succeeded in winning that battle. But I think there was a sense at which you weren't supposed to get into the details of like whether you want to vote for Al Gore or George Bush. Like, of course, Wynton himself would vote for Al Gore, but we weren't engaged in that level. Long story short, 2004 rolled around after the Iraq War, after so much death and destruction, after it became clear that this was all a big lie and a total disaster for us and for everybody that was caught in the middle of it, and that the end result was going to be just as bad or worse. After it was clear all the mistakes of this administration, as well as the dishonesty of it, it was possible that our country was going to vote back into power the same administration, the same regime. People that had, good choice of word, the same people that had proven their immorality and incompetence. We were going to vote them in again. 2004 rolled around. I thought, my sister at the time was writing software for the Democratic Party election software, campaign-related software. And I was also in touch with many people who were working for the Democratic Party on campaigns. And I myself had gone with John Ellis, actually, to canvass, I think in the 2000 election maybe. And I started to think, like, well, what could I do that would be bigger, that would help to bring us all together and to try to reorient us to get more involved and be proud not of being detached, but of engaging in the messy details, including the compromise, the conceptual compromise of even agreeing to this idea that, we need to raise money for our candidate, which is itself, I would say, a profoundly flawed system that makes all the excesses of capitalism worse. And
right, so that's true. So by engaging in it, you are accepting the premise of
you're,
money in politics and contributing to it to some degree.
I would strongly argue that by not engaging, you're also accepting the premise.
Yeah.
So the problem is, what we need to do is engage with trying to dismantle that element of our system, which, of course, the Republican Party exacerbated by Citizens United by putting all these conservative judges on the Supreme Court, whose job on the Supreme Court was to open the doors to even more money from even more rich people and huge PACs. So that's a longer conversation, but both parties are guilty of allowing more money into the electoral system, but the Republican Party is more guilty, which gets to why we're here supporting Kamala. There are many such cases where the two parties, to a complete outsider, doesn't pay that much attention to the details, look equally guilty. But when you do look at the details, you see that actually one party is far more guilty. Mm-hmm. And therefore, if you don't support the lesser of the two evils, so to speak, the less guilty party, then you're essentially supporting the more guilty party, because you're allowing them to win the election unopposed. I respect people that spend their life trying to improve the system. I respect people that analyze the system and say it's profoundly flawed, explain what the flaws are, and then spend as much time as they have on their hands and they believe they can afford to try to change that system, no matter how they go about doing it. If you're a revolutionary and you believe in armed revolution, you think that's the only way to upend the system and change it for the better, you have the right to say to me, you're complacent, you're complicit, mm-hmm. you're accepting things you should not accept on a moral basis. Join my revolution. Mm-hmm. I respect you. I may or may not join your revolution, but I think you have a right to say that to me.
Yeah.
If you're completely outside the system and you're cynical and you're complaining about the system accurately, you're capable enough, savvy enough, and paying enough attention to recognize what's wrong with the system, but your answer is to just detach, I don't think you have standing to mm-hmm. make that complaint. Mm-hmm. So personally, I try to convince myself, which is hard to do sometimes, that it's not enough to complain. You have
As a matter of fact, once you recognize the complaint, it comes with a certain responsibility. That's what I'm hearing you say.
I believe that. Yeah. I was shocked that everybody was still detached after the tragedy of 2000. Yeah. And I understood perfectly why it was hard for some of my friends, my peers, to get excited about the John Kerry candidacy. However, I was in a unique position because John Kerry was a senator from Massachusetts. I had lived in Massachusetts, grown up in Massachusetts. I'd gone to high school with John Kerry's daughter. I knew a fair amount about the life of John Kerry. I knew about his anti-war activism. I knew about his bravery and heroism in the Vietnam War. And I saw that he was actually, though patrician, and he didn't have the touch of wanting to make everybody have a beer with him. He actually was quite intelligent, quite capable, and had a view of the world that I thought would make the world a better place compared to his opponent. Yeah. And he was as qualified as anybody could be for the job. And I wanted our country to be the kind of place that could elect a president not on the basis of who was going to be the coolest guy in the 8th grade class, or who you want to have a beer with, but who was most qualified for the job and who would do the best job on policy matters. I wanted us to be a more serious country that was, capable of electing an Angela Merkel, for example, despite her lack of charisma. And it was devastating to me that, we could potentially elect George Bush twice after he had shown his incompetence and the immorality of his entire administration. We were going to reelect these guys. That was not the country that I wanted to call my own. And so I realized that, okay, well, this is the nature of our system. I don't have a right to complain unless I try to do something about it. So
right, fair.
What little thing can I do that can take advantage of the skills that I have without changing my profession, right? Yeah. Which is another option. I could just become a full-time political activist. Or
talking to you, I could see that would actually be a possibility for you.
Maybe, I could decide to write things. There's a lot of things I could do, but from the inside of my profession, using the skills that I had and the connections that I had and the people who I knew who cared, at least we could make a political statement. It was never really about raising money in the sense that I thought that the specific amount of money we would raise would make the difference in the election, although I did recognize this idea that the elections are often ties and, small amount of airtime actually can have an effect. But it was mostly about making this statement that we the jazz community want to re-engage. We want to re-engage with the messy details to try to make this world better and at least not recapitulate the same mistakes that we just made.
You still frame the conversation, and I respect it, around choosing between the two candidates that are in front of us and who you think will make the better choices. Can you think of a single candidate in your lifetime who has not been a Democrat that you would have chosen to support in that context?
Well, it depends on who the opponent was, right? It was extremely easy to get the jazz community to come together, all generations, ranging from Roy Haynes, and Hank Jones on down to Glasper at the time, like people in their 20s, to play for Barack Obama for many reasons that we can also discuss, good reasons and less good reasons. But, his two opponents were about as qualified and capable as any two Republican candidates that I ever encountered in my life. They were not George W. Bush. In fact, they had opposed George W. Bush at crucial times. And in many ways, in our two-party system, they're about as deserving as any two Republican candidates. They have many different policy positions from me.
John McCain and
Mitt Romney.
Right, of course.
I lived in Massachusetts. Mitt Romney was my governor. He was quite good. Obamacare was based on Romney Care.
Yep.
John McCain is the only person that's ever tried to seriously address our immigration problems.
And campaign finance with
He
Feingold.
supported campaign finance support. He was completely bipartisan. He was a true patriot and a hero, and can't ask for a better Republican candidate than those two. So could I imagine, a Democrat Party candidate who would offend me so much that I would rather support, or would have such different policy positions from me,
or be so unhinged,
or be so unhinged that I would support a McCain or a Romney over him? Well, yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
I mean, I felt that way with Trump when I saw so many lifelong Republicans supporting a candidate who really didn't even represent their party or what their general position had been for so long. And I asked myself the question because I'm a Democrat, or I've always voted Democrat. It's the closest thing to what I am as a Democrat, I guess, given the options. I always ask myself, well, what would it take for me, given what it would mean for the Supreme Court and all of the, everything that trails behind the presidency, to vote for the other party?
Yeah, it would take someone who's, demonstrably dishonest, selfish, or anti-democratic, autocratic. Yeah, I can imagine that would happen. Hopefully such a Democratic candidate would never make it beyond the primary.
Have you had musicians over the years who have said, you know what, I just prefer not to get involved in this. I don't want to.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, many.
Is it because everybody has their own reasons, but do you sense that it's because there's a fear or a concern that it will affect their reputation?
In certain cases, there's that. I could but won't name you examples of that. There's basically three possible reasons why they wouldn't get involved. One is that they don't support the nominee because they support the opponent. I can name this person because he's on record publicly as saying that. Like, many people said, oh, what about calling Paquito?
Yeah.
No, Paquito's staunch Republican.
That's a single issue voter, though, I would assume.
You might think so, but I think it's more complex. You can ask Paquito himself, but he'll proudly tell you all the reasons why he's a staunch Republican. Chick Corea, honestly, who was a friend of mine, I considered him a friend. He told me, no, I'm a Ron Paul supporter. Okay, that's a whole conversation in and of itself for a different podcast. Yeah, those are people that publicly would not support a Democratic candidate, have policy differences, extreme policy differences with the Democratic Party. So yeah, I knew enough not to ask those people. Or in Chick's case, I didn't know. Yeah. So that's the one. That's one reason. Yeah. They don't support the nominee because they support his main opponent. Yeah. Or they support a third party candidate. Yeah. Like someone who supported Cornel West, for example, who I have enormous respect for.
Did you study with Cornel West?
I never took a class with Cornel West, but I have interacted with him a few times. Yeah. That's a whole nother podcast topic too. But anyone who comes to me and says like, no, I love Cornel West, and I think I need to vote for Cornel West. Yeah. Like, I hear you, I feel you, And the third reason is that they don't want to engage on this level. Like, I don't want to. Also, there's four reasons, I guess. I don't want to engage because I'm above this system, either because I'm a critic of the system or because I have musician concerns and musician values, which are aesthetic, creative, and I don't want to busy myself or tarnish my precious neurons with worrying about this kind of dirty stuff. Or I'm implying also some critiques of the system, which are usually on point. Like, I think all my musician friends who take that stance, their critiques of the system are correct, and I agree with them, most of them. The question is whether that then justifies the disengagement. And I strongly think that it doesn't justify it, but I respect people's, it takes a lot to be a great musician. If you're a great musician, you say, I don't want to worry about politics because I need to, use my music to make the world great. If I believe that your music is great, and I'm grateful that you're out here, I have nothing to say to you. I mean, except for I love you and thank you for your music.
And getting back to the thing that you said initially about what a great musical experience can do to an audience and make them feel that they belong to something much larger than themselves.
Yes.
The hope is that once you've experienced that feeling,
yes,
and once you've tapped into whatever that universal source is, that the right choice will reveal itself to you.
Right. So my favorite example of this is somebody that I have the most profound respect for, both as an artist, creative artist, and human and humanitarian, which is Herbie.
Yeah.
I have actually asked Herbie if he would play. I have talked to his people. I know him just a little bit, and he's never been available, so it's never really come up. But I imagine there's probably a part of him that would, I imagine his answer might be something like, I would rather engage in this other way, because he's already engaged, right? He's a UN ambassador.
Yes.
He's
UNESCO,
right? Culture ambassador. He's engaging to spread this message that jazz is international. It's not mere, it is Black American music, but it's also a gift to the entire world. And, maybe he feels like he's a citizen of the world at this point, and he is.
Yes.
He doesn't want to think of himself as a political activist in America. He wants to think of himself as an international political activist. Mm-hmm. There's a part of me that would like to think of myself the same way. So I hear it. And of course, or if he said to me like, I'm 83 years old and I need to think about music, I need to apply myself to being the great artist that I am. Thank you, Herbie, for being on this planet and for giving us the incredible gifts that you've given us. He has that standing to say no. And I have enormous respect for that. And then the fourth reason is the one you stated, which is I don't want to lose any fans. Republicans buy jazz albums too, so to speak.
Turning the Michael Jordan phrase on jazz.
Correct. And I've heard that too, and that speaks for itself.
Yeah.
So 2004 came around. I thought, if I don't do this job, nobody's going to do it. No one is going to put jazz musicians together to play a fundraising concert for John Kerry. I think if
it didn't exist, there wasn't one?
There was no such thing. And that's not true, for example, in 2008. Mine was not the only one on offer, and there were lots of people that were, trying to put things together and also like asking me if they could participate in ours. And by that point, we had sort of set this example, and there were lots of people that had different ideas about how it should be done and who should play and what styles of music should be involved. And I supported all of them. I went to all the Obama fundraising concerts, and I, tried to convince everybody to do more. And I think, we did take advantage of that moment, and Obama had those special gifts as a politician, charisma being number one, that allowed him to, win elections by larger margins. And they were still close to ties, but they were, true victories.
Yes. There was no disputing it.
Yeah. So Kamala has many skills, but she doesn't have that level of charisma. We haven't had a candidate since Obama that has.
Yeah.
Bill Clinton had it, and Obama had it.
I did think about that. I mean, I assume that if Biden had been the candidate, that you still would have done this.
Well, that's a great question. And I had been postponing the decision about whether to try to organize another concert for Biden, because we did organize one in 2020 during COVID, and I had been postponing that decision, hoping that, in fact, something like what happened would happen. I would say I was 65% sure that it would happen.
Yes.
And so I was biding my time to see if it would happen and hope that I wouldn't have to make the really hard decision about whether I should try to do it if it didn't happen. And it's hard for me to say what I would have done, but I think it would have been very challenging to put together a concert in support of a second Joe Biden candidacy. I think it would have been very difficult, and I myself would have had serious reservations about it. And of course, if Biden had run in this election against Trump, I would have canvassed and I would have, voted for Biden, but it would have been with a lot of a lot of reservations.
That is very telling considering everything we've talked about so far. I mean, what it says is that the Biden candidacy required a sort of suspension of disbelief. Like you have to just basically believe in a certain kind of magical thinking that this is reasonable, that we accept that this is what we want for ourselves. So what you're saying is...
It's not policy-based. Anyway, long story short, it would have been very difficult for me to feel good about promoting Joe Biden as my candidate simply for mental fortitude reasons at his age. It just seemed too clear that he was not going to last another 4 years. I didn't want us to be a country that was incapable of replacing a sitting president with a better candidate who could, at minimum, be healthy for the next 4 years. I don't want us to be a country that elects 81-year-olds unless they're acting like 60-year-olds.
But that brings
which Biden was not.
That brings us back to what you are asking of everyone in the room when you put an event like that together last night. I mean, you're asking of, that incredible collection of musicians on stage and the audience to share in a kind of sense of hope and optimism for what we're building. And you can't fake that. You personally can't get up on stage and act like you believe it's the right thing to do if you don't.
Correct. It's well put. I don't need to restate that. That's one reason why it was easy to get people to play for Obama.
Yeah.
And why I was so moved the very first year in 2004 when Christian McBride said yes, when Dee Dee Bridgewater said yes, when Joshua Redmond said yes, when Michael Brecker said yes, when Jeff Tain Watts, when Savion Glover said yes. There was no precedent for it, and I knew none of them were excited about John Kerry. I was more excited about John Kerry because I was the one who had been paying attention to the fact that John Kerry was actually a good senator from my home state. They just understood that George Bush could not be reelected again after the disastrous 4 years that we had just lived through, solely on the basis of he was going to protect us, this bullshit kind of argument that they were selling. So they just objected to that whole idea that you could pull a fast one on us and we haven't been paying attention. No, we're paying attention enough to know. And they accepted this realist principle that I fully accept, which is, we have a responsibility in our democracy. If we benefit from living in this society and following the rule of law, and having the opportunities that this very privileged country affords us, that we need to engage in the political system that gave rise to this country and continues to undergird this country enough to participate in it as citizens and do, as Dee Dee said last night, do our duty and vote, engage at least that minimum amount. You don't have to put on a concert, but you do have to vote. And that voting is a responsibility, which is why we should teach civics to everybody, which is why we need to educate, publicly educate our population to make informed decisions so that we don't end up in this situation where we can easily be hoodwinked into voting for, Donald Trump twice or George W. Bush twice because we think he'd be fun to have a beer with or we think he's funny, and we don't worry when Trump says something authoritarian because it's just a joke. Oh, he's just entertainment, or, whatever people's reasons are that are not well informed. We need to educate people enough to recognize disinformation, especially in an internet-driven political system. We're not doing that. We failed. We got the president we deserved in 2016 and also in 2000 and 2004, sadly, despite our concert, because we have failed as a country to educate all of our citizens to a high level. We have become a country, and it's very easy to say why, and it's still sadly not talked about very much. We have zero equality of opportunity because our education system is based on property taxes from the neighborhood that you happen to live in. Your school budgets are tied closely to the property taxes in your neighborhood, and the school quality correlates disturbingly with economic advantages in particular neighborhoods, particular counties, and school districts. So, it's just unfair that if you're born into a particular neighborhood, your education is going to depend on how much money people in that neighborhood make. That's a crazy system, especially if we pride ourselves on equality of opportunity. It goes against the entire notion of public education. It's completely anti-meritocratic, and it's morally offensive, and nobody talks about it. And both parties are actually guilty in this because we have so many, not in my backyard kind of cases where there's been chances in liberal states and liberal communities like Brooklyn, New York City, and New York State to change this. And people say, oh, no, well, I moved into this neighborhood because the schools are good. And my little Park Slope neighborhood is an example of this. We have a great public school, elementary school, 321 down the street. Property values are high in my neighborhood because that school is good. Everybody wants to send their kids there. That is profoundly immoral and unjust.
I'm also reminded, and I know that you must be constantly aware of it yourself, that you went to one of the most elite universities that I don't know, where'd you go to high school?
I went to a private elite high school called Milton Academy.
Ah, yes, you went to Milton Academy. Okay.
I was a beneficiary of this completely unfair, elitist, anti-democratic, anti-equal opportunity system that allows certain kids access to a much higher level of private education.
And then you went to Harvard after that.
But I also, before that, I should say that I went to public elementary and middle school, but in a town called Brookline that had reasonably good public schools. So I also benefited from that unfair, advantage, privilege, so to speak.
And so then the question that I ask is, do you need this kind of education to reach the conclusions that
I hope not.
That you've reached, although it is telling that the result of all of that privilege has led you to a deep recognition of how broken the system is.
Well, right. So I think that I tend to overestimate the value of a quality education in terms of instilling moral values and ethical values in its beneficiaries, right? So it is quite possible, and I know there are many famous examples of this. Let's think of like Elon Musk. There are plenty of beneficiaries of elite education who end up essentially having selfish, ego-driven values, right? Even to the point where they're willing to contemplate the possibility that the products that are making them rich are going to lead to the end of humanity.
Yes, destroy the world. Absolutely.
And proudly say that. 80% Elon, I heard this video of Elon saying, 80% chance there'll be a good outcome, to AI and these robots that I just invented. 80% chance. Meaning 20% chance there could be no more humans on the planet, but it won't matter to Elon because he'll have zipped off to Mars or Jupiter and started his second colony already. Yeah. But I think we are in a dangerous situation at the moment because it seems to me like the people with the most ascendant trajectory from a power standpoint are the tech leaders. The combination of like the new military industrial complex is made up of tech innovators and venture capitalists who are sometimes the same people. And they're the ones who are starting to move the levers of political power. You can see it's very obvious in the case of Elon and Trump. And that's just going to be ascendant. And I think there's a lot of evidence, especially AI is the best example of it right now, the issue, especially the conversations about the dangers of AI. There's a lot of evidence that these technologists and geniuses in this area really don't care about the rest of us. They really just don't give a shit. They are profoundly selfishly motivated, and they're also motivated by, this abstract value of like technologism, like the advancement of whatever it is that, floats their boat at the moment. And that is profoundly dangerous. It's a different kind of danger than say destroying the planet slowly or at this point, in a medium pace. Yeah. This could be the singularity that leads to elimination of humanity. And there's Elon like just laughing about it. He obviously doesn't give a shit because he feels insulated from that danger.
Yes. And also, if you take the initial conversation that we had around, okay, jazz can change the world. Sonny Rollins said it, Winton has said it. There have been people over the years who have said it.
I did mean to express a tiny bit of skepticism about that, by the way.
I felt that, but there's this kind of an innocence and a romance around that. And I think you did express skepticism in the sense that these are all kind of theories that are not really provable, but there's just a sensibility that there's something about this that can change people.
I only work on these kind of political fundraising concerts once every 4 years. So the other 3 years and 300 days, that I'm alive, I need to justify my existence to myself on a daily basis. Like, why am I doing what I'm doing? If I didn't believe that I was capable of moving people and hopefully causing them to fragilize themselves, to use Bracha's metaphor again, feel that sensation of being part of something larger, right? Unifying yourself with that of another and realizing that this is the basis of ethical behavior, right? To feel what it's like to care about the other person's interest is the source of ethical behavior in Bracha's view, I didn't really explain the view, but it essentially like we are born, it's a Humean type of view. It says we are born with this biological capacity for empathy, which comes from the way we enter the world as part of another, right? We only learn to be selfish and egotistical later. We're dependent for a long time, but then you see a kid you start to think about their own needs, and that's a learned, and you're in this fight, this internal battle, the Star Wars type of dark side battle, where you're fighting between the part of you that's selfish and the part of you that feels the force of good, right? Which is just to say, like, the force of being part of something larger that's for the benefit of your fellow human and maybe even fellow creature or planet or universe, that is going to win or lose, right? And you see it with Trump, like the nativism and anti-immigrant mentality that Trump is trying to instill in us is all about bringing out that inner selfishness and that tribalism, which is quite ironic given that our country is built on immigration and how it's quite offensive to me as a jazz musician, especially a white, Jewish jazz musician who plays Black American music with a large number of African American friends. That is another reason why I'm motivated to these kind of concerts. I've said it already, but it's quite clear Trump's not subtle about how he uses these attacks. I mean, the attacks on Haitian immigrants, they're not subtle at all. There's no more dog whistles.
Yes.
They're not dog whistles. The dog is right there.
Yeah.
And it's a fierce one. It's an ugly, and it's a offensively brutal, scary dog.
Okay, so two things I want to talk about briefly, because as I started saying an hour ago, this is going to be our short, pithy conversation.
Sorry.
I know you well enough to know that this is where it goes because you're so thoughtful, which leads me to the first of hopefully the two threads that we can tie up here. One is, I am very moved when I see somebody like you who is so much in your head. You've thought a lot about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and you clearly had options. I think people are called to make music and play music, so whatever options you had, maybe it didn't feel like you had an option.
It did. I felt like I had options.
You felt like you had options. Yeah. And you chose this. And I think by choosing this, given all of the privilege that we've talked about and all of the resources that you had and, your gifts, extra musical gifts, I'm very moved when people choose to devote themselves to making music, because at the end of the day, it is not an intellectual exercise.
Right. Exactly.
To privilege that other part of yourself and say, this is the most important thing to me. This is how I want to spend my life. I just have to sort of acknowledge it when I see it, because I think so often people don't know why they choose to do it. And I think that you do know why you chose to do it.
That's true. Yeah, I think if we step back a little bit, most of our main motivators in life are not intellectual. Mm-hmm. People love for non-intellectual reasons, right? People try to have sex with each other for non-intellectual reasons. Yeah. People eat for non-intellectual reasons. Mm-hmm. People breathe for non-intellectual reasons. People exercise for non-intellectual reasons. People support sports teams for non-intellectual. People like great music because it moves them. In certain cases, they can get intellectually fascinated, but same goes with art. Great literature is usually intellectually stimulating, but it also, at the end of the day, it speaks to you on a more visceral level. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not surprising in a way that I would make a life decision such as, to become a jazz musician, not only for non-intellectual reasons, but because I privilege the non-intellectual side of me. But because I think that's just why people decide stuff in general, because we're moved. Being a jazz musician was something that I didn't think was possible. I didn't think it was a career option for me, but the music moved me as a kid, and I did also, along the way, have to use my brain to get better at it. It's very demanding, as you know.
Yep.
It's not a coincidence that Herbie is both the musician that moves me the most, that I've interacted with and heard live in my life, and also the only jazz musician that I've encountered whose brain I thought was just operating on a higher level than anybody else's. Like, there is a intellectual component to being a great improvising jazz artist. I don't think maybe intellectual is the wrong word. It's a highly cognitively demanding skill, and It's not intellectual in the sense that it has anything to do with academia, but it is highly demanding of your resources, your cognitive resources, as is being a great athlete, of course, great writer, of course. Long story short, I chose to play this music, one, because it was just something that moved me with a beauty that I didn't understand when I first encountered it. It was also the hardest thing I'd ever tried to do in my life. Harder than, my academic or educational demands that were placed on me in other areas. And I got kind of pulled into the possibility of whether I could ever do this on a high enough level that I could make something beautiful, contribute some beauty to this tradition. And then once I got to the level where I could actually play with people and make a living at it, I got pulled into that visceral experience of being part of something larger than myself and contributing something that was more than the sum of the parts, and fragilizing myself on the bandstand, so to speak, so that, a great band plays as one and surprises not just the audience, but ourselves constantly. And, this was happening on stage last night in band after band after band without any rehearsal. Sometimes people had never played together before, because we have that skill that we develop as jazz musicians to be able to get up there and through empathic listening and a lot of in-the-moment decision-making create something beautiful and spontaneous that has a magic that no other form of music can actually achieve because of the improvisational element. Like, that is some of the highest level experiences I've had in my life. Probably the highest level experiences I've had in any realm have come on the bandstand with people. And the second highest level have come from listening to people doing this live. So, I got inspired last night by various moments, by Josh and Joe Lovano.
Joshua Redman and Joe Lovano playing together. I have no idea what they talked about before they started playing. Was such a beautiful moment of connection, of surprising one another, of surprising us. The amount of music that they managed to make, given
zero rehearsal.
Yeah.
Of course, I knew that was going to happen. That's the fun of being a curator. You create those situations that are likely to lead to some magic. And sometimes it leads to way more magic than you ever could have predicted. And of course, you can't predict what the exact magic will be. So even if it's, 50% of the magic, it's still magical. In that case, it was, it superseded my expectations, as did various other moments in the concert. Like, that is an enormous reward, right? As a musician participating in that, it's an enormous reward. Even as a listener, it's an enormous reward. As a curator, once every 4 years, it's an enormous reward.
But it's funny. It's also interesting because you talk about being a curator. I've spent quite a bit of time talking about jazz festivals. I think it's great. I think it's wonderful that people choose to flock to a place and consume a year's worth of music in 24 hours or 48 hours. But maybe they go home and they're full and their hearts are full and they've got a bag full of new records to listen to. Maybe that is what happens. But there's something even more kind of urgent and immediate about it because of the context. Last night also, it's for a cause as well. So it's imbued with another sense of meaning.
Yeah, so I think you touched on two crucial points. One is, I have noticed, although I didn't predict this in 2004, but I learned it quickly from that night, that there is something special about musicians playing for a cause that's larger than themselves, that larger than their art, and putting their art in service of something that is societal, that actually makes the music better too, right? So this is the connection to the point I made at the beginning, that jazz was always politically engaged, and that what fueled so much great music, right? When people were fighting for their civil rights, literally playing through their horns, their hearts, asserting their humanity, or in certain cases their superhumanity, right, against the odds, being treated as second-class citizens, trying to move the audience to inspire change in the society and also speak up for themselves, so to speak. That made the music better. In 2004, when Jeff Tain Watts and Savion Glover got on the stage, got paid zero, had never played together, and were there to support this cause, which was essentially, to be honest, getting rid of the Bush administration government. It didn't have anything to do with John Kerry. That was transcendent.
Yeah.
So I realized that, okay, this is actually a kind of art form in itself.
Yes.
The concert for a cause art form. The problem with those concert for a causes in general is that they ended up being jam sessions.
Yeah.
And I'd been to enough of these kind of all-star jam session type of concerts that I knew that's what I didn't want.
It has to be a little more structured. It has to be
a lot more well curated.
Yeah.
So the balance between structure and lack of structure is where the art comes in, right? So as a curator, your job is to think about the course of the night, the course of the billing, and it's tricky when you're asking people to play for free and you have only one day that you can do, and who do you include and who do you not include. So that it's an inspiring experience for us because we're playing for free, so nobody would do it if it wasn't amazingly rewarding for us.
Yeah.
And if they didn't believe in the cause, and then the audience wouldn't pay unless word had spread that these concerts were going to be good, right? And they were going to be special, and not just, people don't want to just give them, they might as well just stay home and give the money to Kamala if that's all they care. They want to transcend an experience. And I want to give them that, because if I'm not, I don't feel right asking for their funds to come to this concert, right? I want to move them even if it weren't for a great cause. But in fact, the fact that it is for a great cause is part of what will move them, even they don't realize that. And the musicians, sometimes the musicians are also not aware of that. So, and that's what I've noticed. Like, oh yeah, I'll go play a song with so-and-so for Kamala. Sure. And then the energy is magical on the stage. And it's been true every single concert. This was, I guess, the 6, 1, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20. Yeah. Every time it's had that energy. So now after 6 times, I believe it, that there is, exactly as you said, something quite unique about this particular purpose that we have. And I think I have kind of figured out how to program the right amount to create the possibility of magic, not too much, not tell people what to play, figure out when each group should play. And I feel like, I have developed over the years some skills at this, and also awareness of what the pitfalls are, and make sure that I don't make any of the mistakes that I've made in past years. And in some ways, this concert was actually, if I look at the how rushed it was, how late we started, and how successful it was, in a way it was the best because
you started after Kamala was
announced. I started after, and even then I didn't really get seriously to work on it until this month. So it's basically all kind of come together in October, and we only went public 1 week ago. There's a lot of different directions it could have gone in, and I'm aware of all of those. Sometimes it's intuitive. You make these decisions just like on the bandstand. You're making quick decisions in an intuitive way, but you're trusting that your intuition is actually taking into account a lot of factors that you're not actually consciously in touch with. And I think like this was an example of that. There were certain things that happened last night that I couldn't have predicted or articulated why I did things in a certain way, but it felt like they were the right decision at the time, and they turned out to be 10 times more successful than I imagined.
There's a whole like subgenre of corporate speaking and corporate training, which tries to in some way explain or argue that improvisation and jazz is useful in business.
Yeah, right. Greg Thomas makes money doing this. Yeah.
It's convenient. I think there's something real about it. I also think it's a little vague in its way, but I do remember asking John Ellis, our mutual friend, the first week of COVID, I remember asking him, are jazz musicians more prepared for this than the average person? And his answer I loved was, well, we're more prepared for not knowing when we're going to get paid. We're more prepared for just having to figure out how to survive than the average person.
But less prepared for how to social distance. That's
true. But I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that the experience of having to trust your intuition after a lifetime of training on the bandstand has served you, and it may be playing out in this role also.
I think that's right.
Who did you call first?
Christian. Yeah, right. You missed the beginning. So the funny part at the beginning, there are a lot of things that happened at the beginning before you showed up, but one amusing moment was I told the story of how we ended up there on that particular day, and it basically came down to, hey, Christian, big brother Christian, like, are you up for a Jazz for Kamala this cycle? You think we should do it? Like, do you think we should go for it? And he was like, solid, hell yes. I was like, okay, but when are you available? He's like, well, here, talk to Griffin and my manager. He'll give you my schedule. And then basically, like, Griffin came back to me because I went on Christian's website and I was like, oh, he doesn't have a lot of time this month, but I couldn't do it earlier. I couldn't do it in November. It was like had to be in October. And Griffin's like, well, we got the 20th or the 26th. I was like, that's it? 20th or 26th? He was like, yeah. 26th was a Saturday night. It wasn't great for me. I was like, all right, 20th. Fuck it. That's it. In a way, it was easy, right? So then asking people I went to the people that were there at the beginning, like Dee Dee Bridgewater, Joe Lovano, right? They were the crew that were there at the beginning, and they've been there for most of the shows along the way. And if they wanted in, I was sort of feeling like, okay, if they want to do it, then I actually feel responsible for like making it happen, because it's just me. Like we need to do it. I got the vibe from them, like, no, we need to do it.
Yes.
So then it was just a question of, could we find a venue for that only one particular day? And I tried 30 something venues. It really, we got very lucky that LPR was available on that day that we needed.
I thought it was a great venue.
It was a great venue. But the funny part is that the 20th was Kamala's 60th birthday. So yesterday was Kamala Harris's 60th birthday, which I'm giving credit to Christian, being the busiest man in jazz show business, for somehow intuiting that it was Joe Lovano who said, wait a second, it's Kamala's birthday, which is pretty great. So long story short, I went to those people, and then it was it just all came together from there.
So then how does it expand? I'm just curious, how does it expand from Christian McBride?
To be totally honest, like your first goal is to make sure you have some headliners. If Joshua Redman signs on, if Ron Carter signs on, that is going to get more people, more butts in seats. I think the next call was to Ron. It was an email. And, I feel very fortunate that Ron Carter answers my emails fast. I think they got back to me in like 9 minutes or something. Once Ron was in and Christian, it's just, it's easy from there. Josh, I didn't expect that he would say yes.
Did he fly in?
He flew in. He was the only guy that flew in. But I always ask him because we're close, and he was there at the beginning too. He hasn't been able to do any of the prior ones, so I was very happy that he was down to come for this one.
Were you stressed?
So the stressful part is the preparation part, not the making the bill, not the choosing the artists, because that's a kind of joy, the joy of curation, imagining what's going to happen, bringing people together. That's joy. The stressful part is just the logistics of, creating a website. I had a great help from, Sherry, my former manager, made the website, and coordinating with the team, the campaign, and just making the whole thing logistically function so that people can go to the website, buy a ticket, but the ticket is actually a donation, and then we get the list of people, of donors in exchange. Just making sure that part of it is smooth. That's the stressful part. And the other stressful part is, of course, like marketing the thing, especially because I'm a social media antipathic person, not just incapable person. Like I'm highly skeptical of the role of social media in our society and in our jazz community. And at this point, we had no choice, because it was so late, but to try to attract 250 people there basically only through social media. So I was the absolute worst person to try to make that happen, but I had no choice. It was definitely easier to motivate to do it because it was for this larger cause, but I had to figure out how to do it, and I had no idea how to do it. So that part was a little stressful. But the playing part is the reward and the joy. So that there was zero stress there. And then, the actual, like, watching the night unfold in front of me was enormously rewarding, and also zero stress. Like, I know how to play a concert. I play millions of concerts. Yeah. I know how to, enjoy my friends when they get up on stage. Like, that was just the pure joy of it. And maybe to kind of conclude, I was aware that there may be protests, and I predicted correctly, which was fortunate. I sort of prepared the venue for it. I prepared the campaign for it. I prepared Dee Dee for it. I prepared myself for it. And in fact, it happened. And, in many ways, I'm happy that it happened. I think if I hadn't been prepared, I would not be as content that it happened. But I'm a firm believer that the cause that the protesters were there to trumpet and protest was a just cause, and I have supported that cause myself. I have profound disagreements with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden administration about their support for Israel in the Gaza war and in general on this topic. I do believe, happy to go on the record to say it, I do believe the government of Israel has committed collective punishment, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. There's just way too much proof of it, and Israel has sadly become an apartheid state, and the occupation of Palestine must end. In fact, there should have been a Palestinian state 60, 70 years ago. It's completely inhuman the way that the IDF has carried out this war. So I would be there, protesting with the protesters. Where I strongly disagree with them is I don't believe that you can take one issue and make that the only issue that matters in an election. And I think that's a complex argument. And I think the easier argument is simply that for this particular issue, if Trump wins the election, it's going to be far worse. It's far worse. Sheldon Adelson, Miriam Adelson, Trump, Bibi, they're a team. If you're pro-Palestine, the last thing you want is Bibi to stay in power. The last thing you want is a Trump government in power. I'm completely anti-AIPAC. I'm completely against, the impact of the Israel lobby on American domestic politics. I am a staunch supporter of Kamala Harris in this election. If she wins the election, I'll be out there protesting. But at this point, if you're anti-Kamala, and these protesters are clearly anti-Kamala, I hate to say it, but you're pro-Trump. And for the cause that we both believe in, Trump is the absolute worst thing that could happen. So for me, that's the easy argument, and I haven't heard any good counter-argument to that.
Aaron Goldberg, thank you for running all this down with me today. I'm glad that we're doing it the day after, because I think any more time passing, we would be further and further away from. We got into some great stuff, but more than anything, I just want to thank you for your service, for your generosity, for your time that you put into this, because I think it really does make a difference. It's not only about the money. I'm curious, can you say how much money it raised? Do you know?
So far, we've raised $42,500, about $42,400 something dollars. And sometimes people are moved to, donate even after the fact. We've seen that in prior years. So that's still possible.
Yes. Well, I encourage everyone to donate after the fact.
There is no after the fact until the election.
That's right.
Right.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Leo.
There he was, my friends, Aaron Goldberg. What a thoughtful and extensive conversation. I'll be back again in your headspace with another deep dive before you know it. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.